Okay, so before we proceed with the transactions, here you can see when you are trying to create a transactions or invoices. So there are a couple of fields like here, transaction sources, transaction types, and the customer details. So now before we proceed with the transaction, now we'll try to understand that what are these transaction sources, transaction types, and then I'll show you how to set up a customer or customer sites, and then we should be able to proceed with the transaction data entry. Okay. So first I'll explain you the transaction sources. So for the time being, I'll keep this aside, auto counting. Then we'll go to the transaction sources. So there are different transaction sources available in the system. The navigation is set up transaction sources. Set up transaction sources. As you have seen in the transactions window, these are all the mandatory. So you need to understand all these transaction sources. So there are two kind of transaction sources. One is manual source, and another one is imported sources. When the transaction is coming from the external system, or when the transaction is coming from the other Oracle modules, the source for those modules, the type for those will be imported. So take an example, order management. Okay. So do a F11 and control F11. Okay. Let me order management. Yeah. So this is the order management. For the order management, you can see the source as imported. Sorry, the type as imported. When you see a type as imported, all these fields will be enabled. So all these tabs will be enabled. And look for say manual F11 and look for say manual. If you say manual, all these are disabled because all these tabs will have some significance only if it is a imported transaction source. For the manual transaction source, which is nothing but the transaction source which you use to do a direct data entry within the AR module, all these things will not come into picture. So I'll just show you, I'll explain you one for imported and one manual. Okay, so this is the transaction source which is used for the order management. Okay, so when the transactions are coming from the order management, so if you go to the transaction screen, at the top the source will show as order entry, delivery, invoicing. So you cannot manually try to create an invoices in AR with a source of order entry, deliver, invoicing. You can create invoices or the transactions in AR module only with the source where the type is manual. For the imported sources, obviously, as the name itself says is imported, it should come from the source system. You should not be able to manually key in those invoices. So, a couple of options here: the description, active, whether this particular source is active or not. Only if it's active, it comes in the drop down. And there is something called transaction batch numbering. So you can even group and transactions into one particular transaction batch. Even in AP also, I did not show you, but like even in AP also, you can group the invoices into one particular invoice batch. It's only just a naming convention. You just create a batch, put a name, and then click on invoices button, and then you should be able to create all those invoices under that particular batch. Similarly, even in AR also, you can create something called transaction batch, and within the transaction batch you can create the transactions. It's only just to group the transactions with a name. So if you are using the particular transaction batch screen, then what is the transaction batch number, whether you want to manually enter or whether you want to check this checkbox of automatic batch numbering. Automatic transaction numbering is for the transactions under the batch. When you are creating, whether you want system to generate the number, if you want the system to generate the number, check this particular checkbox. And if you are using the document sequencing functionality, copy document number to transaction number. So if you check this particular checkbox, whatever the document number which system has generated, the voucher number, the same number will be copied to the transaction number. So we will have two fields there, document number and transaction number. So whatever is the document number, it will be copied as the transaction number. And allow duplicate transaction number. If you check this particular checkbox, then you can create more than one invoice with the same number in this particular source. Ideally we should not check this particular checkbox unless until if there are any practical difficulties, because again it will create some kind of a confusion whenever you are querying the invoices. So generally do not check this checkbox of allow duplicate transactions number. Okay, and couple of other options are when you are importing the data from your auto invoice, if there is one invalid line, whether you want to reject the invoice or whether you want to create the invoice with only the valid line. So obviously you should go with the reject invoices. And when you are importing the data from your order management or from the external system, and for those transaction, if you specify a GL date which falls in a closed period, what do you want to do? Whether you want to reject that or whether you want to adjust that. When you say adjust, it is going to adjust that to the current open GL period. So take an example, you are getting the data from an external system with a GL date of say 30th of August. Okay, August period is already closed because today is October, so we would have already closed August period. So if you say GL date in a closed period option as reject, so auto invoice program is going to reject the particular lines saying that the GL date is in a closed period. And if you select this as adjust, so what will happen is your auto invoice program is going to import them, and it is going to import them with a GL date of current open period. So GL date of 1st of October, it is going to open create that transaction in the October period with the date of 1st of October. And as I mentioned here, these are the grouping rules. So if you remember, like we have entered, we have seen these grouping rules when we were talking about the system options. So there was in the system option, we have mentioned the grouping rule as the default one, but for each source, again, you can specify your own grouping rule. So grouping rule is when you are getting the data from your external system, how do you want to group the data? In AR interface, in AP, we got two tables: AP invoice header interface, AP invoice lines interface, and I think AP invoice distribution interface also. But as far as the AR is concerned, we do not have header and lines. We have got only one table, RA interface lines all, and there are a couple of other things: RA interface distributions all, RA interface sales credit all, and a couple of things. But as far as the headers and lines are concerned, we have got only one table, which is RA interface lines all. So one table will have the data for both headers as well as the lines. So if there is a data of both headers as well as the lines in one table, how does system understand what line should be formed as one particular invoice? Okay, so that is what you actually define under your grouping rules. Okay, so that is what you mention your grouping rule. So I can okay, for a while I'll close this form. I'll just pick up this particular grouping rule. Grouping rule. Okay, just do Control L. Okay, you can have different grouping rule for invoice, debit memo, credit memo. Okay, so for invoice, so here you can see there are again different optional grouping characteristics. So here you got so many different ways on which you can group. So here you can say interface line attribute 3. So what it says is interface line attribute 3 will have a unique number. So based on that particular unique number, you can group all those lines into one invoice. So that's what this particular what do you call grouping rule says. So take an example. You got 10 lines in your R interface. So say line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, for these three lines, your interface line attribute 3, it all depends on your configuration. I'm not sure like what is interface line attribute 3 here, but it's a unique number. So interface line attribute 3 could be some value, maybe it is 1 to 3. So in this case, if you go with this group by, it says group by interface line attribute 3. So in this example, this will be created as one invoice, this will be created as second invoice, and this will be created as the third invoice. So that is the significance of uh, your grouping rules. And again, if you are building any new uh, uh, interface from the legacy system, or in any your implementation project, whenever you are testing your integrations from other modules like order management, or getting up the data from your AGIS or from say service contract, then this needs to be tested properly. So you need to tweak these grouping rules, whether the grouping rules whatever provided by, in some cases for the standard seeded sources of order management or global intercompany or projects or service contract system provides some uh, seeded grouping rules. You need to test whether those grouping rules are satisfying you, are meeting your requirements, or you can actually use the additional field. So in our place for the order management source, we have I think 4 or 5 different grouping rules. So it's again first group by this, and then again group by second field, group by third field, group by fourth field. I think you all understand like how group by works in a SQL query. Okay, going back to the transaction sources. Can you guys hear me? I can see some you may be experiencing degraded audio quality. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes.
I don't know why I'm getting this message.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so pick up our source of yeah. So that's the grouping rule. Payment default, but I'm not sure about this one. What is this payment details default hierarchy? Anyways, that's a seeded one. And allow sales credit, again, if you want to use that salespersons and sales credit functionality, check this particular checkbox. Otherwise, do not check this checkbox. And as far as the customer information is concerned, whenever you are getting the data from the source imported system, how do you want to import the data? Whether when you are getting the data, whether you want to go by IDs or whether you want to go by the values. There are a lot of things: bill to customer, bill to address, bill to contact, ship to address, ship to customer. And I mean, obviously, now in a while I'll explain you how to create a customer, then I'll explain you what is bill to and what is ship to. So these are all again seeded values. And when you are getting the data from the source system, when they provide the transaction type and all these details, whether you want to go by values or whether you want to go by IDs. Okay, so all these FOB point, freight carrier, unit of measure, all these things are applicable only when you are getting a data from the order management or from any other source system wherein you want to import these things. Again, this particular sales credit functionality is also applicable only if you are using the salesperson in AR. Okay, so that's with regard to the transaction source of imported. Now transaction source of manual. I've created one transaction source with the type as manual. I think I had created, or it's already existing. Okay, there is already existing one. So this is already an existing one. Okay, so there is a source by name manual other. Okay, so here again you say active. Okay, because you want to use this automatic batch numbering and automatic batch numbering. So it will now starts from 10,001. Automatic transaction numbering. Now it will starts from 10,000. And obviously all these fields will be disabled because it's a manual transaction source. We are not importing anything. As you are not importing anything, all these things will not come into picture. When I'm explaining all these things, I'll explain you that like when you are importing from the source system, how your auto invoice program should behave, and when you are getting the data, how your customer details and other details should be brought, whether you want to use IDs or whether you want to use the actual values. As this is manual source, all these things will not have any impact, and hence all these things are grayed out, just the first one. Okay, now we can try to create an invoice, okay, with a source of manual other. If you go to the transaction screen, you, as I said, that you will be able to see only those transactions or only those transaction sources where the type is manual. So here you will not be able to see order entry or other things whatever we have seen, the global intercompany projects or something like that. You are able to see only these two sources because only these two sources have the type as manual there. Okay, that's about the transaction source. And next one is the transaction types. So in AP, if you remember, we have different kind of invoices, which is your standard invoice, debit memo, credit memo, mixed invoice, expense report, and so on. Similarly, in AR we have got different kind of invoices like invoice, debit memo, credit memo, deposit, guarantee, and chargeback. So these are the different six kinds of invoices. In AP we just say invoice, standard invoice, debit memo, credit memo. But here those things are called transaction classes here. And for each transaction class we need to have something called transaction type. Okay, I'll explain you in a while like what are those transaction type. But for each transaction class you need to have transaction type. For invoice transaction class we need to have some transaction type. For debit memo transaction class we need to have transaction type. Similarly for credit memo also we need to have different what do you call transaction types. So those different kind of transactions in AP are called a kind of transaction classes in AR. Okay, and also always we use the word invoice in AP. In AR we always use the word transaction. Okay, so transaction is nothing but different kind of invoices here. Okay, now we look at these transaction types. We need to have at least one transaction type for each transaction class. Setup transaction types. First we will create a one transaction type for invoice transaction class. Okay, so again you can see all those transaction classes, right? First we'll start with the invoice. Okay, again these are OU specific. Okay, in the drop down I should be able to see only Reliance Cotton Extraction. The reason being, what is the reason for showing only one operating unit in the drop down?
MO
The
operating unit.
profile.
Yeah, it's an MO operating unit. Yeah, so all these transaction types are OU specific. If you want to use the same transaction type in a different OU, then you need to recreate the same thing in the different OU. So even though we have MOAC and other stuff, but unfortunately as far as the AR is concerned, again for the transaction type you need to recreate that in the other OU where you want to use that. Okay, first we'll create a transaction type, okay, for invoice. So I'm just using the word manual INV, that's a naming convention. Invoice, it's already exist, or maybe I think I had created this. Let me query this. I think I have created just the invoice and the other things we should be able to. Okay, I had created this manual invoice. Okay, I'll explain you then. Class is invoice. Transaction status, we have got a couple of transaction status. If you want to use this, use the status as. If you want to actively use this particular transaction, obviously put the transaction status as open and do not put any end date. And the creation sign, this should be positive. This being an invoice, so invoice is actually a positive invoice, or an invoice is created with a positive value, then you need to enter the creation sign as positive. Printing option, once you create transactions using this particular transaction type, when you run something called invoice print selected invoice standard program, system will allow you only those invoices which are created with the transaction type where this printing option is set as print. If you set the printing option as do not print, then when you create any invoices using this particular transaction type, then you will not be able to print those invoices. So by default set this printing option as print. Okay, and then obviously whenever you create any transactions using this particular transaction type, you want that particular transaction to update your accounts receivable balance, and you want those transactions to be posted to GL. Okay, obviously you need to check this particular checkbox of open receivable post to GL. Okay, and next one is allow freight. Okay, if you want any freight, generally if you create your order management, if you create an invoices from the order management, then obviously even freight should be also be coming from the order management. But again, if there is a scenario wherein you are not using order management and you are creating invoices directly in AR module and you want to create a freight, then check this checkbox of freight. When you create your invoice in AR, so you got line item, freight, and tax. So these are the three items. Even in AP also you got line item, tax, and freight. So similarly in here also we got line item, tax, and freight. So if you want an invoice which is created using this particular transaction type wherein you want a freight to be entered, check this checkbox. And this particular checkbox of default tax calculation is a very important checkbox. If you check this checkbox, then only system will allow a tax to be calculated on this particular invoice. Obviously, now we will not be able to test that unless until we get into the EB tax configurations. So you have enabled the EB tax rules, okay, and you want the system to calculate the tax based on the EB tax rule, then you need to check the checkbox of default tax classification. So there could be a scenarios wherein you have enabled your EB tax rules, you have set up all these EB tax rules, but for some specific transaction types, you do not want system to calculate any tax. Then for those scenarios, you need to check this checkbox. So recently, even in our current client, there are hundreds of transaction types. We have identified around some 50 transaction types, wherein some for some business reason they do not want tax to be calculated on the transactions which are created for those transaction types. Then obviously you should not be indating or deleting your EB tax rules. EB tax rules will be still in place, but for only those transaction types, we have navigated to those transaction types and uncheck this default tax classification checkbox. So if you uncheck this default tax classification checkbox, system will not calculate. If you check the checkbox, system will calculate the tax. I mean, as far as now our current session is concerned, we have still not enabled our EB tax rules. So we'll leave this as is. And once we set up our EB tax rules, we can come to this particular screen, check this checkbox, and then we can test this. Okay. And a couple of other things: receivable account, revenue account, and tax account. Unbilled receivables and unearned revenue account are used in some other scenarios. But at a high level, these are the three important accounts: receivable account, revenue account, and tax account. Okay, so does anybody remember what exactly is the accounting entry for AP invoice?
Expense to the liability.
Yeah. So for an AP invoice, the simple journal entry in a simple scenario without any discount or withholding tax or some other complication, simple journal entry would be expense account will be debited and liability account will be credited. That is for AP. Similarly, in AR, okay, without any complications, the simple journal entry is receivable account will be debited and revenue account,
Revenue.
yeah, will be credited. It's a simple journal entry without any complications. Okay, if there is a tax on this invoice, then receivable say $1,000, revenue say $1,000. If there is a tax on these invoices, then the journal entry will be okay. Receivable account debit $1,000, revenue account credit $950, tax account credit $50. So that is the simple journal entry whenever you create an invoice. When you again take this particular simple scenario, when you receive the money from the customer, can anybody guess what will be the journal entry when you receive the money from the customer?
Your revenue account will be debited.
No.
Cash
Yes.
account?
Cash account will be debited, you are right. And what is credited?
Receivable account would be credited.
Exactly, because you need to reduce your outstanding balance. Okay, so you are receiving something from the customer. So as per the rule, debit what comes in, you need to debit your cash account. So cash account will be debited with 1,000 rupees, and you need to reduce your receivables. Okay, so receivables whatever is being debited earlier will be credited now with 1,000 rupees. So the journal entry will be cash account debit, receivable account credit. So after this, you can see the receivable account 1,000 rupees which got debited is credited with 1,000 rupees. Now there is no outstanding receivable balance. So the net impact or net journal entry is cash account is debited and your revenue account is credited. Okay. and hope you guys are following the accounting entries document whatever I've sent you, the P2P cycle. Similarly, I'll also share the same document for the O2C cycle once this once this entire AR sessions are done. Okay. Okay, so that is the reason why in all the transaction types you need to specify your receivable account, revenue account, and tax account. These three are more or less kind of a mandatory. If you do not set these accounts, then I'll explain you what will happen. Okay, so this is the transaction type for the invoice. Okay, similarly, we need to have at least one transaction type for each of those transaction classes. Okay, if you do not have this particular transaction type for each of the transaction class, and then when you go to your transaction screen, you will not be able to complete the transaction entry because this is the mandatory field there. So there are some couple of clients wherein under one transaction class there could be multiple transaction types. So here I have created one particular transaction type, but for the same invoice I can have another transaction type. But what is the reason for the particular transaction type? The reason is for those transaction type these attributes will be a bit different. So maybe allow freight could be unchecked. Default tax classification could be checked. So take same example. So in this case, I have created a transaction type of manual INV with a transaction class of invoice with a default tax classification unchecked. I can have one more transaction type with say manual INV2 or something like that, some naming convention, and I can check this particular default tax classification checkbox. I can have a third transaction type wherein maybe I can change this receivable account and tax account. I can have fourth transaction type wherein I can have something else. Okay, so that is the significance of having multiple transaction types within a transaction class, but one is mandatory. Any questions here? Okay, assume there are no questions. Okay. I have created for invoice, and let me check for the credit memo. Did I create or F11? F11, put the value, control F11. I did not create. Okay, now now I will try to create it for the credit memo. Okay, manual credit memo. What will be the class here?
Credit memo.
Credit memo. And what will be the transaction status?
Open.
Open. And creation sign?
Negative.
Negative. Printing option? It should be print because you want to print those invoices. Okay, and all other things being kind of an optional, you can say allow freight. Okay, and enter the corresponding receivable account, revenue account, and tax account. These three are mandatory. That's the credit memo. Okay, and we'll also create with the debit memo, and then we'll proceed, and then we'll come back to the screens later point in time when we discuss about these things. I'll also create one more for debit memo. Okay, what should be the class?
Debit.
Debit.
Debit memo. Transaction status will be open.
Open.
Creation sign?
Positive.
In AP it is negative, but in AR
Exactly, yeah, exactly. In AR it is positive. Okay, I'll come to that a bit later. Let me complete this. Printing option is print. Okay, and receivable account. So I'll explain you the difference between the debit memo in AR and AP. Let me complete this receivable account and revenue account and then tax account. Okay. Okay, what is the difference between the debit memo and credit memo in AP and AR? Okay, can somebody tell me from an AP perspective what is debit memo and what is credit memo?
Uh, Credit memo, that the supplier is giving the either the discount or the amount in the reduction, total amount in the reduction.
Uh-huh.
And a debit memo that we as an organization, we do not have any reference, but we are doing uh, reducing the amount in the total amount.
Exactly. So both in AP, both debit memo and credit memo are both negative invoices. If the initiation is done directly by the supplier, wherein he realize that the invoice amount needs to be reduced because he has overcharged or he want to give some credit to us, then a memo will be raised by this vendor, and that is called a credit memo. That is going to reduce the value of the invoice. And debit memo is the memo which we raise to reduce the value of the invoice. Hey, we say that, okay, even though the vendor send us say 1,000 rupees, we say that 100 rupees worth of goods were damaged. I'm not going to pay you. So you raise the debit memo. So both debit memo and credit memo are negative invoices in AP. As far as the AR is concerned, debit memo and credit memo both are raised by you. Debit memo is the memo which is raised to increase the value of an invoice, and credit memo is the memo which you raise to decrease the value of the invoice. So you generate an invoice and send it to the customer for say 1,000 rupees, okay, and later you realize that, oh, I should have charged him some freight charges which I missed out to charge in the original invoice, and then for 100 rupees, then you raise the debit memo for 100 rupees. It is increasing the value of the invoice. Okay, that is one scenario. And the credit memo is decreasing the value of the invoice. You realize you have charged 1,000 rupees to the customer, and customer says that no, you have overcharged me 1,000. I'm not going to pay you 1,000 rupees. I'm going to pay you only 900 rupees. Then you raise that credit memo of -100 and send it to the customer. Okay, so credit memo is the reduction in the value of the invoice, and debit memo is the increase in the value of the invoice. So hence, when you are raising a debit memo, the sign should be positive. When you are raising a credit memo, the sign should be negative. Okay, so we have yeah.
And Arvind, in this case, like whenever there is a change in the transaction, like a corresponding reference is there, like a debit memo corresponding to a particular transaction. In that case, it will print that particular invoice, Arvind, or we have to do it.
No. So in the see in AR, for a credit memo, okay, you can directly create a credit memo against the invoice. But as far as the debit memo is concerned, we don't have a standard functionality of linking a debit memo to the invoice. Debit memo is like any other invoice. Only thing is you need to even again send this particular debit memo invoice also to the customer. So in this example, you have already going back to this. So in this scenario, you have already created an invoice for 1,000 rupees, send it to the customer. You realize that you should have even charged 100 rupees extra, which you have not done in the earlier invoice. So create a debit memo, again send this particular 100 rupees to the customer. So that means now customer has got two invoices. One is for the original invoice of 1,000 rupees and debit memo of 100 rupees. There is no standard field which actually references that, but in some of the kind of a description fields or some of the extra notes field, you can put the value. I'll show you like in our current client how what we are doing. Okay. Does this answer your question?
Yes, Arvind. So for credit memo, at least can we? So we have a link, right? So
Yes.
how are we going to print it? Like, if you print with respect to this particular transaction, if you want to send an invoice, so we will be sending only $1,000 invoice and minus $100 invoice. Is that the way how we
Yes.
will do?
See, from a system perspective, internally there is actually what you call link between your invoice and the credit memo. Okay, and when you are sending that particular credit memo to the customer, also you will actually provide some kind of information somewhere in the form wherein you mention that this is a credit memo against so and so invoice number. So that's how the customer understand that this particular credit memo is for so and so. I'll also give you the screen or like the description where system stores that particular credit memo. But looking at that particular credit memo, definitely the customer will have an information which will explain him that this is the credit memo against the so and so invoice.
Okay. Okay.
And Arvind, so in this case, then instead of a debit memo, we can raise another transaction also, right?
Exactly.
I did,
Yes, you can also do that. See, the other option would be you can just create another standard invoice for 100 rupees and you can give it to the customer.
Okay, so there technically there is no difference, is it, for
Exactly.
debit memo
Technically,
and
from a system perspective, there is no real difference between your debit memo and standard invoice, because from a system perspective, also, I'm not sure like why Oracle has given such kind of functionality. There is no standard system way of storing the original invoice number in the debit memo, but in the reference field or some of the description fields, you can obviously you can enter whatever you want. So one
okay.
option would be raise the debit memo in some of the description field somewhere you can enter that original invoice number, so that in your invoice print program, obviously you can customize your invoice in any client. Obviously your invoice print program is custom program. We will not be using the standard program, so because standard output definitely not meet any custom client requirement. So as part of your custom program, you also write a logic to pull the data, if any, under the particular extra field, and under the particular extra field you can actually put all this extra information whatever you want. If it is especially a debit memo, you can put that particular it's a free text wherein you can mention the corresponding original invoice number.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's with regard to transaction. Yeah.
So basically, debit memo is increasing the value in our receivable account, and the credit memo is decreasing the value in the receivable account.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay.